podcast can set a great tone as a suggestion that combines an upbeat and inviting spirit without any background music. Welcome to Tangelic Talks, your go-to podcast from Tangelic, where we dive into the vibrant world of clean energy, development, sustainability, and climate change in Africa. We bring you inspiring stories, insightful discussions, and groundbreaking innovations from the continent making waves in the global community. Tune in and join the conversation toward a brighter, greener future. Let's get started.
Welcome to Tangelic Talks, a podcast at the intersection of equity, energy, and empowerment with your co-host Victoria Cornelio and myself, Jensen Cummings. In today's episode, we discuss how women lead the fight for climate justice with our guest, author Dr. Peg Spitzer. Dr. Spitzer is a research professor in the College of Arts and Sciences at the State University of New York at Stony Brook. She studies women's leadership in climate change adaptation through environmental and gender equity strategies and oral histories. Dr. Spitzer, thanks for being with us.
Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you. It's great to be here.
We're honored to have this conversation. So I'll start with the first question, then Victoria will jump in. And for me, I wanted to kind of set the stage. Can you tell us about the nexus of gender, climate change, and transnational advocacy, how you define the space you kind of work in?
Yeah, well, I think that there is an increased interest in understanding how you can bring the other 50% of the population that often gets not really recognized, and that is women, into this intersection of climate change, which is really important because it turns out that women are quite vulnerable, especially in the global south, the developing world, to the effects of climate change just by the roles that they fulfill in society and in their communities. So that's really the nexus of that. And then the transnational advocacy part is important because what we find is that while you look at women in individual communities, the thing that really is the winner, the success frame, is to push that out so that it goes across national borders and so that women can share ideas and communities can share ideas with each other.
That was a very clear and articulate definition. Thank you so much for that. And how did you find your way into this work specifically? And then I'll let Victoria kind of go down a few rabbit holes with you.
Yeah, I guess I found my way into the work by first going to Gujarat, India, and looking at farming communities and the way that they're integrating an irrigation technology in 3 farming villages in Gujarat. So that was kind of the first big project. But even before that, I think that there was a sense that we needed to look at different types of roles that people fulfill in society. And so it was really interesting for me because I looked at first, I'm a China specialist by training, actually, Chinese language and culture. And so I was looking at women in U.S.-Asian relations and the way in which women fulfill those roles. And then it just kind of morphed over into other areas, other communities, and so forth.
That's amazing. And that's a breadth of experiences I can imagine. So I'm wondering, when it comes to that, I was looking at your book, Empowering Female Climate Change Activists in the Global South. I recommend everyone to at least give it a quick skim, and then you're going to stay reading it. It's great. I actually quoted it a few times during my time at university, so quite fun. I really enjoyed it. But I just wanted to understand a little bit what inspired that and how you came about writing that piece.
Yeah, well, I guess one of the things that I was noticing is after the work in Gujarat, I started working with the Women and Gender Constituency, which is a constituency group in the United Nations Framework Convention for Climate Change. Big words. But, the annual climate change conference that occurs every year. Within the context of that, there's an award that's given to the top 3 projects in women and gender just climate solutions is actually what it's called. And so I served on the jury for that. And I started looking at the people and the solutions that communities were finding that worked in their various regions. And that's really the impetus for the book. Hey, we have the Gujarat example, but let's look at Guatemala, Colombia, Vietnam, and so forth to really expand out and give. The idea is to uplift, to give solutions. We know that there are vulnerabilities, but what are some of the solutions that are that are presented. And so that's how I really became interested in doing that, writing the book. And then now I have a nonprofit that is brand new, about 2 months old, called the Climate Knowledge Collective, which is pretty cool.
And in the book, you highlight the effort of women farmers in India, and you talked about your time in India as well and things like that. I'm just wondering if you can share what lessons we can learn from their resilience in facing climate-related challenges, like droughts and floods you talk about a lot in the book as well.
Yeah, I do. And I think one of the things that really comes out is that, especially in patriarchal societies or traditional societies, because really to understand more about what that looks like when we're trying to find solutions for climate change. And the interesting thing about that case that I think we can all learn from is the idea of what you can combine with some of the talents or some of the benefits that women have being close to their communities and using technologies that then help alleviate the effects of climate change. So the example that we were talking about, Victoria, was this notion of droughts and floods, and what do you do about farming? And how do you collect water? How do you provide water so that in the floods the nutrients are washed away, and in the droughts there's no longer? So the Narita Services developed this technology called bungru, which means straw in Gujarati. And the solution was that women couldn't own land in India for the most part. And, you kind of look at that and say, well, Trupti and Biplop, the founders of this social enterprise, started out trying to figure out how they could overcome that strategy or overcome that problem, really. And what they decided was that it was a losing battle. You weren't going to be able to get women to own land, but what you could do, and Trupti and Biplop were engineers, was develop an irrigation technology that could be used in farming communities and give women the rights to the water. While land is power, water is power. And that was a significant aspect. It was a combination of learning what women's strengths are and then what technologies they can have control over that become really important in almost all of the cases that I looked at in the book.
Yeah. No, and that's amazing because I think a lot of times when it comes to solutions, there is that thing where we want to make sure the solution includes the context that we're working in, right? And there's something about not just replicating everything the same, but finding how do we fit in everybody in here. And I think that's something I really value about your work as a feminist advocate in climate change specifically, because there is that gap there where gender necessarily isn't really looked at as either a very specific thing that we need to consider or as something that we're just taking for granted within the conversation.
Yeah, I think that's a great point, because Trupti and Biplop found in their work is that while you could have women sort of at the lead, you had to integrate that into the problems of the community. And so one of the things Biplop discovered, going around to the various farming communities, there were a lot of boys that were unemployed, that had dropped out of school, that were just kind of hanging out in the center.
Yeah.
And so what he ended up doing is sort of integrating them into the projects as well. So that was really good, having them measure water levels or, dig holes for the irrigation technology, whatever it may be. So I think that integrative approach is very important too.
I agree. And you conducted 85 interviews for the book, is that correct?
Yeah, for all across. Yeah. It was really fascinating. What we're doing now is even in the oral history framework of the Climate Knowledge Collective, we continue to develop these oral histories from around the world that are just fascinating, because we're seeing, on the one hand, I guess, consistency in terms of how people are addressing the problem, but also differences just in terms of what problems they encounter and so forth. I mean, there are migration patterns that are different, men going to work in other regions where women are then in charge of the farm, different ecological conditions of land and so forth. Domestic violence is a big issue when you're dealing with people who are struggling in general.
Yeah, and something I really appreciate about the feminist perspective is sort of not just looking at how climate change impacts people, of course, but how it changes dynamics within people. Because that example you've given about now women are in charge of something that historically they haven't really been included in really changes that dynamic within that community, doesn't it?
It does. And one of the things that's interesting about it is it doesn't happen overnight. In other words, one of the things that Biplav and Trupti and others discover is that you just can't put women in charge because in many countries, there's some difficulty with raising levels of self-esteem and confidence, which is really interesting too to think about. How you end up doing that is significant. And so a lot of the upfront costs are, talking with both men, asking men to bring women into the conversation, and also then giving women the confidence to pursue the things that need to happen to provide solutions to their communities.
Of course. And from those interviews, is there any specific stories that you would say profoundly impacted you or sort of shifted your perspective? Maybe you came in with an idea and after those interviews, it was like, wow, one of those that give you an epiphany, so to speak.
Yeah, I guess they're all interesting. I should try to do that, right? One of the things that I found interesting, another solution, was in Guatemala, the development of mealworm farms.
Oh, what's that? Sorry.
So mealworm farms are pretty interesting. They were actually developed cultivating mealworms for protein sources, because in the highlands of Guatemala, there were no way to have animals. There was no land really to cultivate into plants. And so it was actually the scientists at the University of Chicago and the University of Wisconsin, so two Midwestern places, that developed the technology for cultivating and developing mealworms so they could be ground up and used in biscuits and other kinds of things. Because in that particular area, it was 2/3 of the population were malnourished. So it was as a result of climate change. So it was women that were cultivating these mealworm farms that are about, this big in their kitchens, and developing those and then figuring out ways to process them and so forth. So for me, that was inspiring. I mean, I've talked with many people and they would say, oh, mealworms, ew. But in fact, you have to think of alternative sources for protein. So I found that a particularly, just awareness-raising issue, I guess. The other thing that I would say, in Vietnam, for example, we did a study of women who were introducing cookstoves to their communities, more efficient cookstoves. And over time, when they started developing the skills to be able to introduce the cookstoves, to go into the homes and talk with people, okay, so the cookstoves broke down. And the actual technology wasn't beautiful at the beginning. That was sort of an interesting awareness-raising thing for me, because it's not just, oh, you have this technology, you introduce it in the community, and there it is, and then it's a matter of developing it. They break down, and then people become frustrated, and then they want to throw it out. And so there are aspects of, introducing new technology into communities that I think needs to really be understood in terms of, just so not a picnic. It's, really different as we go on.
Yeah, of course.
Yeah, and I had a question on that. How do you suggest that we help the adoption of new technologies in some of these communities? Do you see examples of the way that that's working without forcing it, without a round peg in a square hole? Like, how have you seen that happening at a high level?
Well, I think one of the things is this transnational advocacy, Jensen, that you mentioned at the very beginning, is, you have to continue to have lots of different people involved in understanding how to use the cook stoves and introduce the improvements. So you're right, you don't want to force things in, but you can show the benefits and then show how they're working in various places. And I think that's really important too. So now, for example, in Africa, there's a huge solar-powered cook stove movement that is just, really taking off, and it's connecting with these different types that it's not forcing anymore. It's kind of, okay, this is what's happening. This is how we can introduce this, and to understand that there are ways that, there are going to be hiccups in the system, but that everybody's working on it together. So kind of a collective approach, I guess, is the best.
Yeah, I really like that community aspect that you keep bringing into the conversation. I think it's really important. And I'm just wondering why you chose to focus on the global south for this type of work. What sort of drove you down there? Was it your trip to India? Did you have sort of just specific questions around the global south? And if I can just ask you to define what you encompass as the global south.
Yeah, it's a really good question. And it's been, the word itself has been critiqued very much. Global South began to be used in international arenas in the 1960s. And it was supposed to represent underserved, poor communities. And it's just a catch-all phrase. So you have to be careful about that. But there are differences because I wanted to focus on the Global South or communities that were underserved or poor communities around the world. And I really found that even the concept of Global South, if you will, if I'm looking at underserved communities, can apply to many different regions, including, for example, New York City. I mean, in the Bronx, one of the studies that we did in the Green City Force in the Bronx was really introducing new ways of farming and how to help communities with heat stress and so forth. So the term, or Native American populations in the United States as well. So the term itself is to represent those communities that are not adequately served by the status quo, if you will. But I think that in terms of integrating that with women, which is really interesting, I believe, because in rural areas, in many areas, women are sort of the primary caregivers. They're the food producers. They collect the water, the fuel, firewood and stuff. They're the reproducers of human life. So in that role, I think their health and their well-being, are continually degraded by these constant exposures to climate change disasters. So that's why I really focus on women's roles in the Global South to try to deal with that. I mean, you don't even, sometimes at least I didn't even think about the effect of water as we talked about, collecting water. It turns out that the World Health Organization found that at least 30% of women's daily energy is spent collecting water. So what does that mean? That means that they're at increased risk for waterborne disease. It means that the manual labor involved in harvesting water can cause chronic skeletal pain and damage to the neck and spine and so forth in that area. And then just think about what it means when there's a lack of water and women have to go outside of their communities to unfamiliar areas. It's dangerous, number one, and there's the effect of heat stroke and heat stress, that causes all sorts of things. So that's kind of the combination of what we're looking at when we're dealing with the Global South and the effects on women in that area. I hope that answers your question a little bit more, but feel free to drill down.
No, perfectly. Perfectly. I was going to say that example horrifyingly, sadly, but perfectly illustrates why this gender aspect, feminist literature is necessary in this conversation. Because just the way you've broken that down just makes complete sense why we're looking at women empowerment and female advocates in this sense, because it is a different role to what the man plays in that community, right?
And also because men are migrating for work.
Right.
That has increased fundamentally over the years. So I think that that's really important too to understand. In fact, in the Gujarat example, one of the reasons that Trupti and Biplop developed the irrigation technology that they did was because they discovered that 86% of the activities to maintain the farm were conducted solely by women. So, when you think about that, and that's because men are migrating to other farms, to find work. So these are really significant challenges to vulnerability.
And it really changes the dynamic for sure.
Climate change is social change.
Yes, exactly. And so you've defined what the Global South is. So in contrary, what would the Global North encompass in your eyes, would you say?
I think rich countries or rich regions that aren't as affected right now by the effects of climate change. I think that is, if you were going to have a binary, which I kind of move away from that in some ways, but really it is countries that can afford to deal with the effects of climate change. And I would also say that in the global north, we are the polluters. We are the ones that are doing most of the damage to the environment, but the effects are felt most dramatically by those who are in these underserved communities.
The reason I ask is because in your book, you urge readers from the global north to sort of rethink their contributions in that sense.
Yeah, it is very, very important. And I think that you want to figure out ways that you can help in some way. So I'm in the global north. So how can I help communities? And one of the ways that I have focused on doing that was developing oral histories and putting them out there for people to understand more about the situations that we've just been talking about today. So raising awareness, and then also really connecting with younger people and learning about what their anxieties are, what their feelings are. I mean, at the university level, young people are really anxious about the effects of climate change, understandably. And so to be able to provide some solutions that people in the global south are using and doing, I think is really important for all of us to kind of come together in that.
Where is the level of responsibility and expectation? Is there an obligation? How do we kind of merge that? Because it feels like on one side we have richer countries who can afford to and are some of the polluters. On the other side we have underserved communities. There seems like there's a wide bridge that's being built, but it's a challenging one to do so. Where is the level of responsibility? Is it all on the global north? How do we kind of parse out the expectation?
Well, I think, and I'm not an expert in this, but I think that people should look at the work that the climate change conferences are providing, conference of parties, in terms of what amount of money is devoted for loss and damage. I mean, this is pretty much an issue that is at the top of mind of everybody. And that is, if there are countries or regions in the world that are severely affected by climate change, but as a result of our actions, in the global north, don't we have some responsibility to try to provide compensation in ways that are really fundamental and useful? So the loss and damage funds are very, very important. And so I think that's one way that we really feel that responsibility. And if you look at responsibility also as more that we all have to participate in this. So the expertise, for example, the mealworm project that I mentioned to you, it was scientists from American universities in this case that developed the technology to help, to work with. And so that's a responsibility. To even think about the ways in which this can happen is really important. Another example is coral reef restoration in Belize, which is really significant. I mean, that's affected everybody, really, the ecosystem in general. And so, but it's the poor communities that are really, they're the ones that are at the front lines. And now women are engaged in going underground, diving out and restoring the coral reefs, while American scientists and other scientists are finding out new technologies for helping with this. So I think so the global north bears, I believe, fundamental responsibility for this.
Yeah. And in that sense, do you think there are some misconceptions that global north NGOs or activists have when it comes to working in the global south, or things that sort of don't translate as well?
Well, I think that one thing is sometimes many of the international aid programs they're getting better at understanding, but one of the things that they do is kind of cast women as vulnerable and passive recipients of aid. And I think we've got to get over that and rid of that idea. So that is one thing that's a big problem. Really, we do have to focus on women. It's very significant. I think it's not just giving the aid, and then what happens is you give the aid, maybe for a year or two or whatever, and then go away. And then the communities are back to beginning. So it's introducing ways that can be integrated in the community that can be taken over by the people who live in that community.
That's so fair. And during the book, you also talk about gender just solutions. And I'm just wondering what you mean by that.
Well, the gender just climate solutions are the solutions that integrate a couple different aspects. First, they have to consider the extent to which women are integrated into the solution, or gender, in other words, a kind of a gender equity or balance for that. And what kinds of solutions are being promoted by integrating women into the communities. So, and it's different because there's a lot of different examples that you can pose through that. For example, I'll give you one that's in the book. It's communities in refugee camps in Turkey, in which they really taught women how to build solar batteries for lighting systems. And they taught building the solar batteries was important because it not only helped light the refugee camps, but it was also something that could be sold outside of the camps in the market. So that was pretty significant, aspect of how you can integrate these things and really deal with a couple different, we call it intersectional problems that we really are focusing on in terms of helping women, helping education, and so forth. And also, really providing some kind of economic sustainability for different communities.
And I think that's so beautiful because a lot of solutions to climate change do just improve livelihoods altogether, right? And these holistic solutions that encompass not just one area of work, but all these things that we want to do can very easily serve these communities that we're talking about that might not be as equipped to deal with these terrible things that are happening, terrible effects of the climate crisis that they're also not responsible for, right?
And there is important to have some kind of an advocacy role for these, and really, honor those people who are really working to help with these situation that is ongoing and will be with us for many, many years.
Yeah.
I'm going to cut us off there, but everybody who's watching and listening, don't be afraid. There's more content for you. We're actually going to stay on here with Dr. Spitzer and continue to talk a little bit more. Victoria's got lots of more burning questions to ask. All of those questions, little Q&A, will be available on the blog at tangeliclife.org. So definitely check that out. I want you to be able to watch and listen to this 30-minute episode and then check out the blog post as well to learn. Once again, this was Tangelic Talks with Dr. Peg Spitzer, myself, Jensen Cummings, and Victoria Cornelio. We appreciate you all for tuning in. Please continue to support, subscribe everywhere you're watching and listening to this. Become a part of the conversation. We'd love to hear from you. What are the issues that are top of mind for you that you're working in or that you're being affected by? Appreciate you all for tuning in. Cheers.
Yeah.
Yeah, cheers.
Let's talk power, let's talk change. From rural lights to brighter days. Equity rising, voices strong. We're building tomorrow where we all belong. Tangelic Talks, energy, equity, pride. Empowering the world, side by side. A spark becomes a fire, a vision that's true. Together we rise, it starts with you.